Teamsters is the latest SCOTUS case that's flying under the radar, but you need to know about it. If a wealthy corporation gets their way, companies would be able to sue striking workers for the cost of lost revenue, spoiled products, and more. Be warned.
Lost revenue from customers.
That is an insane additional extra burden to add on top of labor unions. First, they shut off, with Janus and numerous other decisions, they shut off the funding pool, okay? Now they're going after striking, the one tool that the workforce has, okay? The one tool that the workforce has still in this like sea of lack of adequate care is being able to strike, to stop the work. The fact that the Supreme Court could just decide on this against the labor force is I wouldn't say unimaginable. It's expected. Most of the nurses, teachers, people working in like important parts of the infrastructure, like the railroads, as a matter of fact, usually have like no strike clauses built into their goddamn contracts because they have to keep the government going. So let's see what happens in this one.
Imagine you're a newly unionized Starbucks barista discussing whether to strike. You've got lots to think about, but what you probably wouldn't expect to have to consider is whether your union-busting boss, Howard Schultz, is going to sue you for the impact of your strike on Starbucks, for the coffee that gets wasted or milk that goes sour or lost revenue from customers who get tired of waiting in line. But if a Seattle concrete mixing company and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce get their way before the Supreme Court this year, that's the crazy position that American unions are going to be in if they want to strike. And it could be devastating for workers everywhere. The case the Supreme Court is considering is called Glacier Northwest versus International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Local Union 174. And here are the facts. After months of contract negotiations, cement mixers at Glacier Northwest decided to go on strike. They drove their trucks back to the company's headquarters and walked off the job. Workers left trucks that had already been loaded with cement running so that the cement wouldn't instantly harden inside the truck's drums. The strike lasted 1 week before the companies reached agreement on a new contract. The issue in this case revolves around what happened next. The employer sued the Teamsters for tortious destruction of the company's property. Glacier asked a Washington state court to make the Teamsters pay for damage to their trucks as a result of cement hardening after the strike began. The Washington State Supreme Court threw out the case, finding that it wasn't appropriate to apply state law to a labor dispute covered by a federal law, the National Labor Relations Act. The state Supreme Court's decision rested on long-standing U.S. Supreme Court precedent that the National Labor Relations Board decides whether union conduct is protected by federal law or not. This should have been the end of the story. Unfortunately, it wasn't. As we've seen with the supercharged conservative majority currently sitting on the Supreme Court, no precedent is safe. To date, the Supreme Court has recognized the importance of the right to strike and allowed state law to sanction strike activity only when a union's behavior is so egregious that striking workers have lost the protection of the federal law. Think violence on the picket line or obvious vandalism at the employer's place of business.
Of course, endless amounts of violence that workers need to withstand on the picket line is completely appropriate because that violence is conducted in the hands of the police force, which of course has a monopoly of violence. It's the state's violent actors doing such things. So they can withstand that. That's totally legal and totally cool. But God forbid, the moment that you break something, okay, oh no, that would be unacceptable.
But in this case, there are no allegations of violence, and the drivers even tried to mitigate harm to the trucks by leaving them running. Bottom line, it shouldn't be the union's job to make it as easy as possible for an employer to weather a strike. The whole point of a strike is to create an economic incentive for an employer to bargain.
Yeah, this literally undermines the concept of a work stoppage. The entire point of a work stoppage is to make the bosses understand what happens when workers don't come into work. So that's the point. You can't literally turn around and be like, yeah, now you have to bear the cost. That's insane. Now, of course, the Supreme Court can do whatever the wants, and we'll see.
seriously with the union. But even if this was a close case on the facts, which it isn't, the Supreme Court still had no business hearing it. It's the job of the NLRB to decide if strike behavior is egregious or not. So why is the Supreme Court getting involved to open the door for companies to sue unions that strike? Because this court has shown a sustained hostility to workers' collective bargaining rights. Just a few years ago, it reversed decades of precedent to make it harder for public sector unions to collect dues. And 2 years ago, it made it impossible for union.
This is the decision I was talking about. The Supreme Court ruled against public unions collecting fees from non-members in 2018. This is the decision I was talking about. This decision greatly undermined the last bastion of unions in the public sector and the way that they can fund themselves, because the existence of unions alone increase the benefits and the average salaries that people in that sector get, even by existing. Before we talk about collective bargaining agreements and contracts that span over entire industries, we don't actually have that here in America in the same way that we do in France, for example. France has a 98% collective bargaining agreement that encompasses 98% of the entire labor force, even though only a much smaller percentage of the workforce is actually unionized directly. We don't have that in America. America is a 11% unionization rate, and the collective bargaining contracts they do not go across the board on entire sectors. But for that reason alone, it is understandable that you should be able to, as public unions, collect fees from non-members. Everywhere around the world, you see governments that even have labor parties like the UK or Australia increasing their hostility towards any kind of labor action. Why are they doing that? Well, the profit rate has a tendency to decline. So the more profit rates fall, the more profit margins fall, the more you have to work on whichever part you can actually massage, whichever part you can actually squeeze, and that is the workforce. The workforce is more productive than ever before as a consequence of technological advances. So now you can get one guy to do the job of three, right? So instead of cutting the guys' work hours by 3 and keeping the same level of employees, allowing that person to have great amounts of freedom in his personal life, you fire the other 2 and make the one guy do the job of 3. This is how it works. And this is how, while productivity has skyrocketed, wages have remained stagnant.
Unions to collect dues. And 2 years ago, it made it impossible for union organizers to talk to farm workers in the fields of California. And now conservatives are plotting to make it easier for wealthy corporate bosses to be able to sue union employees just for asserting their constitutional right to strike. At a time of historic levels of worker organizing and public support for unions, it is exactly the wrong time for the Supreme Court to make the right to strike harder than ever for workers to exercise. But for the Roberts Court, it seems to always be time to side with corporate employers' efforts to undermine workers' rights.
Yep. Rishi Sunak is also trying to set new laws that make striking for NHS workers harder. I mean, that makes sense too. So we'll see what happens. I mean, is the working class just dead in America? How do we just recover rights? I mean, not necessarily dead, but any amount of labor momentum will be squashed.